You and I have discussed this many times. The Trump administration, for all the chaotic insanity of their rhetoric, of their head fakes, and then distractions, misdirections, and everything that we see coming out of there. The evidence I see strongly suggests that they're earnestly working for peace. And there's a lot of reasons to dispute this if we're talking about Ukraine, if we're talking about Israel and Iran, if we're talking about Yemen, Venezuela, places like this. Because Trump almost deliberately creates almost like a casus belli, like robust preparation for war at the same time as he's negotiating with his counterparts. And then later you realize, it doesn't seem that he ever had the intention of going to war. But there is one place that is not on anybody's radar, that's not a household name, that Trump gets zero credit for, and that is Bosnia and Herzegovina. And Bosnia and Herzegovina is there in the heart of the Balkans. This is where, the capital is Sarajevo. People will remember 1914 Sarajevo. This is where World War I was detonated over 110 years ago. And this is where the British have been agitating for war for years now. And this was obvious to everybody locally. Local people were openly talking about, it's the British. They're pushing us into war. They're provoking all these escalations. The British themselves, their think tanks like RUSI, Royal United Services Institution, were openly writing about the Balkans being the second front in West's war against Russia. And why? Because the Balkans are a powder keg. You have a lot of different peoples there, and the Bosnia and Herzegovina itself is like an amalgamation of Croats who are Catholic, Bosniaks who are Muslim, and Serbians who are Serbian Orthodox Christians. And so it's relatively easy to pit these three people against one another by staging provocations. And this was being done. And we watched for the last 2 or 3 years, provocations just escalate. Muslims against Croats, Croats against Muslims, Croats against Serbs, Muslims against... So this was just kind of, the tensions were rising. And it seemed that descent into war was almost inevitable. And that all changed practically from the day Donald Trump walked into the White House. And I've been, getting those news from people, just kind of hearsay, people's impressions. It seems that people are things are calming down. It seems that these provocations are dying down. They're not happening anymore. And that all started with Trump taking over. And I may have mentioned this, but this is quite significant. This is not a small thing. At the end of October, so 3 weeks ago, I met one of the ministers in the Serbian government in Bosnia, and I asked him point blank, face to face, first person testimony. And I asked him, have things changed since Trump came to power? And he shot straight at me. Oh yes, dramatically. He said the situation is day and night. Everything is better. And he even mentioned something about a lithium concession. They were negotiating it with the British, and he said the British were very hardline, very aggressive, and unyielding in their demands. And he said, now we're dealing with the Americans, and they're much more reasonable, much more accommodating. What does this tell us, Nima? It tells us that, first of all, the Trump administration had to be aware of they had to have been aware of the problem. They had to have understood what the objectives of the British are. And they had to have come in there and said, you guys are out of here, we're taking over, and there's not going to be war. because remember, um, in August of this year, right after the Alaska summit, Kirill Dmitriev, who is very close with Putin, tweeted a very affirmative statement that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump will prevent World War III from breaking out. And he didn't say should prevent it, might prevent it, could. He said will. And now we're finding out that they have been negotiating in secret all along. And for the first time, we hear voices from Russia saying, we're optimistic about this because it's not just about Ukraine. We're working on a whole new security architecture from Europe, which means that the 2 centuries of British geopolitics of, what they call balance of power, of, basically divide and rule, pitting force against force. And as soon as one emerges stronger than the other, then they, kind of orchestrate a war to mow the lawn, I guess, on the continent. We might see an end to this, and we might see a future of peace. Again, I don't think we're out of the woods yet, but this is not random. The diffusing tensions in Bosnia was done deliberately and with knowledge of the situation. And it wasn't done for political points because, if we're talking about Israel, it's harder to analyze because there's a strong Israeli lobby in the United States. There's Christian evangelicals. So everything is very political. Whatever you do, you're appeasing some constituency at home. The situation in Ukraine is also very delicate because it involves all the American traditional allies. So everything they do has to, again, either misdirect or appease or deceive some party in the equation. In Bosnia, not the case. Nobody cares. Nobody sees it. It's on nobody's radar. Nobody's talking about Bosnia. And the Trump administration doesn't have any audience that they have to appease. They just went there and made peace, or let's say diffused it for the time being, the war tensions, because it was the right thing to do. And I think that's very significant. That they deserve credit for it. And it tells me that they understand the nature of the problem and that they are putting in the good work to prevent war from breaking out. Again, total war on the European continent would probably be worse than World War I and World War II combined.
Alex, you mentioned the Trump administration. I don't know how to express it, but I feel if Marco Rubio was the vice president, they could have assassinated Donald Trump.
I think you're right, Nima, but I suspect this. I don't necessarily know it. Marco Rubio is there thanks to Trump's donors. And I don't know what the relationships are, but I do remember one meeting at the White House. Maybe it was with Zelensky, maybe it was with Keir Starmer or something. And Rubio was, Trump gave word to Rubio or something like that. And he said, we're going to be very careful about you. We're watching you carefully. To Rubio. Trump was saying to Rubio, we're watching you very carefully. So, maybe Rubio has some leeway there. Maybe he's on a leash. Maybe he serves a purpose. And maybe if he was vice president, if he was the vice president, then maybe you're right. Maybe somebody would make the effort to assassinate Donald Trump. But right now, with J.D. Vance as vice president, you'd have to assassinate them both. I don't know. But yeah, for sure, there's some creeping civil war going on in the United States and inside of the administration. And I think that's normal because the people who benefited the most through the post-World War II global order are today some of the most powerful people in the world. And for sure, they have very considerable political influence still. They're going to be everywhere. They're going to be in the Treasury Department, in the Justice Department, in the FBI, in the Pentagon, on Wall Street, and so forth, in the military-industrial complex. So this is not a simple enemy to take on. And for sure, they're close in the White House. And Marco Rubio is probably one of them. It's possible that Marco Rubio is not one of them, that he's pretending to be one of them, that he's like an undercover cop, but I doubt that. Marco Rubio has been on the wrong side of the equation, apparently, for a very, very long time. So I expect that he's still on the wrong side of the equation.
I see Marco Rubio nobody without the support that he's getting from the lobby. And who's Marco Rubio, Alex? Because they tried so hard to put Marco Rubio as the vice president of the United States. And you know who was against that? Tucker Carlson. And the people like Tucker Carlson, they said, no, Marco Rubio cannot be the vice president of the United States. That would hugely put Donald Trump in a dangerous position.
Yes.
Look at the X. What's going on X? Look at the way that the Zionists are behaving. They're connecting JD Vance to Tucker Carlson. They're talking about that Tucker Carlson's son is working with JD Vance. These people are so much connected. When we talk about that JD Vance is getting, AIPAC, sort of help and aid, Charlie Kirk was doing the same. These people are helping. But after all, these people, in my opinion, after all, they're independent. They have their own mindset. And when it comes to the moment that they have to decide about it, they're fearing that moment, by the way.
Yes. Yeah. And it seems to me that they are on the back foot. It seems to me that the walls are kind of closing in around them. I don't know what the role of Epstein files is in this whole thing, but I always suspected that Epstein files are probably being leveraged against the administration's political enemies. They have been of late, since Trump declined to make them public, they've been kind of used against him, in the sense that the insinuations that he was involved with Jeffrey Epstein have been all over the social media. It's almost been a cottage industry of pushing out pictures of Trump with Jeffrey Epstein, or of Trump with some young girl. But I don't think that's true. I mean, the DNC tried to destroy Trump for 8 years, and they've tried absolutely everything. And they had Epstein files in their custody. Had they found something they could use against him, I don't see why they wouldn't use it to destroy him. I mean, being accused of working with a known child trafficker and being compromised in that way, it would have been so easy to destroy Donald Trump. And then there's also Julian Assange of WikiLeaks, who said there's nothing that incriminates Trump in the WikiLeaks, in the Epstein files. And Julian Assange is very credible. I don't know that he made a wrong statement based on what he has. So I very much doubt that there's something there. But, something's obviously happening under the surface, behind the scenes, that is, I think, tectonic. And I think that all the globalists inside of the administration are on the defensive, and that the sovereigntists, Trump, Vance, I don't know who else, Witkoff, they're on the offensive. The thing that was confusing me quite a lot over the last few weeks is the question of Venezuela and the question of Bagram Air Base. because that was the first time I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe Trump is control opposition. But we haven't heard anything about Bagram Air Base anymore. He just made a few statements after his meeting with King Charles and in England when he was in London, and then nothing. And then with Venezuela, I still don't know what's going to happen there. But I remember the hostilities with Iran, when they were for weeks they were bringing these B-2 bombers and troops to Diego Garcia and all these assets, making it look like they're completely preparing for a major regime change war against Iran. And then nothing. We had a fake war. Some people say like, oh, no, it was not fake war. He went to war against Iran. No, he didn't. A war is Libya. A war is Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. Those are real wars. Remember Fallujah, how it was in Syria, how it was in Libya. It was like weeks upon weeks of hundreds of sorties, thousands of tons of bombs dropped. This was just one day, couple of things. This was a fake war. So I still hope that the Venezuelan situation will work itself out in a similar way, because we've now just found out a few days ago that as all this escalation and rhetoric was going on, they opened negotiations with the Maduro regime. And then I haven't heard from Machado in a few days. I don't know what happened to her, but she's kind of gone off the media radars. So we'll see. But in general, particularly judging by the statements coming out of Russia, it seems to me that something is happening for real, that the system in the world is being changed, and that it's going from permanent forever wars into something different in a new security architecture, which is hopefully one that will give us a permanent peace.
Alex, in this structure that you mentioned, is the SCO far ahead of BRICS?
How do you mean far ahead of BRICS?
In terms of the security, it seems to me that they have a better understanding of a multipolar world in terms of coming together, security, and what's important. Because in BRICS, you have a lot of discussions that is much, the concept is wider than what's going on in SCO. SCO is so much focused.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, but I think that's understandable because SCO is at its core a security organization, and it's it's the axis is Russia and China, basically authoritarian regimes, let's call it that way, like regimes that are less subject to regime changes. You couldn't come in and start funding some opposition and pushing them forward, and then they take over, and then they renege on SCO obligations and agreements. Whereas when it comes to BRICS, there's a lot of countries that still have these very flawed, very hollow democracies, where one day you might have Jair Bolsonaro in power, then you have like a total turnaround. It's antithesis. Lula da Silva. Then a lot of them have, been part of this dollar-centric world trade system. So a lot of these countries have large trade balances on Federal Reserve Bank ledgers in US dollars. So if they turn away from the rules-based global order too abruptly, they could be sanctioned. They could have their assets frozen, which you could risk bringing yourself into a situation like Venezuela or Cuba, where you're sanctioned and blockaded and embargoed, and your economy starts falling apart, and then you become vulnerable to a regime change, to a coup. And then for some reason all these countries are deathly afraid of the IMF. I can't say that I quite understand this, but every time the IMF comes to some country, basically the political top soil themselves, and they do whatever they have to do not to upset the IMF. And I think that all these things will take time to change, to disenfranchise the IMF, to overcome the fear of economic sanctions and trade embargoes and losing access to their assets in Western banking systems. That'll take time, and this, I think, is why BRICS is so much easier to disunite. It's so much easier to pull countries away from BRICS, like Argentina, like we just saw with when Milei came to power. Whereas SCO is it's the axis is Moscow, Beijing. It's a security organization, and it's completely on the Eurasian continent. It's not all across the world. And then it doesn't have any vulnerabilities to the IMF. They don't care about Federal Reserve funds, US dollars. They don't care about trade sanctions. It's purely a security organization, and in that it's certainly stronger and more robust.
Alex, today's Ukraine, in my opinion, is a testing ground for the military-industrial complex. And all the kickbacks to the pocket of these leaders in Europe, mostly in Europe, they don't want to lose that. On the other hand, the situation politically in Europe is not that much stable to keep it up. And they don't know how to deal with that. But after all, when you look at Europe today, do you think that is there any alternative movement in Europe to replace the current?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely, Nima. And those movements are quite strong in terms of public support. But the people in power have done everything they possibly can to make sure that these people never come into power, that they can never take control of the country's economic policy or a country's foreign policy, especially. And then, the globalist elites control the media, so it's relatively easy for them to destroy any opposition, to raise hysteria about Russia. And today in Germany, for example, anybody who wants to advocate change in policy is immediately labeled as a Putin loyalist, as a Russian stooge. And the level of hysteria that has been created about Russia is such that this is almost political suicide. So I think that while those forces are very strong in terms of numbers and in terms of political support, they are still very easy to silence, to sideline, to basically marginalize in the face of public opinion. And I think that too will take some kind of political transformation in Europe. And I think that we might get it now with whatever it is that the Americans and the Russians are discussing as a new peace proposal. And they've already said that this peace agreement that's been discussed between the Americans and the Russians includes a new security architecture for Europe. And if the Americans are on board with that, then Europeans will have no choice but to submit and to accept it. And I think that the countries that don't submit and don't accept it, which at the moment that might be Poland, it might be Germany, it might be France, it might be Britain, it's almost certainly going to be France and Britain. They're going to be sidelined. And then countries like Italy, Hungary, Serbia, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, they will gain greater political power. They will be able to chart the new way forward. And I think that ultimately it's going to lead to a disintegration of the European Union and a disintegration of NATO.
Did you watch the way that Kaya Kallas was responding to? I don't know if you saw the article she wrote in it was Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. I don't remember the outlet, but she was talking about Kaya Kallas. She was talking about that the power is totally concentrated in the hands of Ursula von der Leyen. These are the two tools in Europe, and they're fighting each other. How if the United States tomorrow decides to leave Europe, who's going to bring these people? Who's going to bring all of these people together? Is that possible, or they're going to somehow disintegrate, and the separation going to happen within the European Union?
My prediction, Nima, would be that they will start fighting among each other. And we already see that. For example, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Ursula von der Leyen, they used to be friends and political allies. They're now fighting between each other because over money, because there's a leadership vacuum. Because before, if the Americans said this is how we're going to do it, everybody else says yes, sir. That's how we're going to do it. Now that leadership is now gone, and so now Friedrich Merz, they're planning to spend all these hundreds of billions of euros on military-industrial complex, on weapons systems, on building up the militaries for war against Russia and so forth. And now Merz wants to spend those hundreds of billions of euros. He wants to have control over the budgets. Ursula von der Leyen is like, no, that should be EU. I should be in charge of spending all these billions. Plus, I really liked how that worked out for me with the pandemic, with my buying vaccines from Pfizer. That's really cool. So I want to do that with the military budgets as well. So now they're fighting. Now they hate each other, and they're making statements against one another. And I think that this is just a foreshadowing of what's going to come. But I think that ultimately, most of the European powers are going to have to submit to the power of Russia and the power of the United States. And if the United States and Russia are on the same page, then the Europeans will have no choice. They will just have to fall into line. And I think that the way that's going to happen is that there is going to be a democratic transformation. And, Emmanuel Macron in France is going to fall. Somebody else is going to take his place. Friedrich Merz is going to fall in Germany. I don't know about Britain. That's a cesspool. I don't know how Britain is going to be able to transform.
No way out for Britain.
Yeah. But at least, the continent of Europe, maybe all the war traps will be diffused, like in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I certainly hope that this will happen, and that we're going to see really a different future emerge. And then we'll see what happens to Great Britain, but maybe it's going to come under international pressure to reform, because there are many countries that have a grievance against the United Kingdom since for centuries, and maybe those grievance, the Russians have literally hundreds of investigative files that the KGB put together during the 1990s, which were then blocked, thanks to the Magnitsky Acts that were imposed, and that kind of blocked the functioning of international law and judicial cooperation between nations. And I think that might have to be forced open. And if those files are pursued, if witnesses are deposed, if investigators and lawyers are hired in places like London and New York and Zurich and Cyprus and so forth, I think that ultimately the plunder and pillage that happened during the 1990s is going to be traced to actual physical persons, to families that benefit from that, and I think it's going to turn out to be the exact same families that were that were ultimately behind the war in Ukraine, that were ultimately behind the first two world wars. And we're now even seeing some statements from, well, it was actually Kirill Dmitriev again just the other day, who was saying that the Great Britain is now the leading instigator of war, the same ones that have been behind World War I and World War II. So I think that all is slowly starting to come to the surface. And if we read history carefully, the United States is also one of these countries that has a major grievance against the United Kingdom.
Yeah. You know what's so amazing to me looking at Russia and Iran today, and the way that the establishment in the United Kingdom sees them, they hate both. They hate Iran and Russia. And the people, what's amazing to me, that the people in these countries, they understand totally that the front line is not the United States. The front line is the British government. It's a long history, but they are running the show without being on the front line.
Yes.
And how do you see the Trump administration or the administrations to come in the aftermath of the Trump administration understanding what's going on? Because right now, looking at the way that Britain is moving toward China, it's going to be the same. But can the United States manage that sort of conflict directly with China, as they're doing right now with Iran and Russia? I would doubt that. I doubt really, really that the United States would go in that direction to confront China.
No, I agree. I agree, Nima. I think that this system has reached its expiration date. I think we're watching the dying agony of that system. And of course, unfortunately, they will not hesitate to inflict any level of damage on the whole world to save themselves. But I think that the awareness of what we're dealing with is rising everywhere around the world. It's not just Russia and China. Obviously, there's a faction of the political class in the United States that is aware of the problem and who the culprit is. I think that the same awareness exists in Europe, and even in some relatively powerful circles. They don't have their hands on the levers of power in the system, but I think that the tide has turned, and there is no chance that they could prevail against China. The Quad is not going to change that. It's not even going to be a thing. AUKUS is not going to be a thing. Expanding NATO to East Asia is not going to happen either. Or if it happens, it's just going to be a paper tiger. It's just for show. NATO can't even prevail in its own backyard. It's really a spent force. So I think the only thing they have is intrigue, espionage, penetration of other countries' political systems with spies, with NGOs, with public relations and education work, and then hoping to finagle some kind of intrigue that allows them to take decisive influence. But over the last 70, 80 years, since World War II, last 70 years, that whole equation required the United States to be the partner that always carries the threat of brute force. So if all these political intrigues and secret diplomacy and spying doesn't yield results, then the carrier strike groups come and they start bombing the place. Well, if there's not going to be brute force, I don't think that the equation does anything anymore. And I think that this whole imperial power is slowly dying, and maybe it's even dying fast by now, because I think already the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan in 2021, and I wrote about this at the time, was probably the mortal wound to the empire. I think that the defeat in Ukraine is probably going to spell the end.
Alex, looking at the Middle East and at the West Asia, and compare it to what's going on in the Latin America, the same people who were arguing that if we go to Iraq and Afghanistan and remove the regimes there, the next would be Iran. And the same concept is coming right now to Latin America. Let's go after Venezuela, then Colombia, Cuba, and maybe the whole face of the Latin America would change, and we will be the winner of the sort of chaos that we're making. But the same strategy has failed in the West Asia. And how can these people imagine that they would get something different? For those people who are arguing, you talk about the Trump administration, but we know that the system, the administration, is under a lot of pressure from different directions. And it's not just a solid policy they put out and say, that's it, we're not going to change it. I'm talking about, after all, in when you look at the big picture of the Latin America, I don't see that coming to benefit the United States in a long run if they go in that direction.
Okay, yes, Nima, but we have to be careful not to fall into the trap of looking at the United States like it's a monolith. Say, does this benefit the United States or it doesn't? Taking over Venezuela would certainly benefit Wall Street and the global banking cartel, for sure. And they are always the ultimate driving force behind wars. It wouldn't benefit the United States any more that having hegemony in the Middle East, in the Far East, in Europe, in other places in Africa and South America benefited the United States in the post-World War II global order, right? They've already been the hegemon in most places around the world. So probably the effect would be, of taking over taking control of Venezuela, the effect will be probably the same as what we've already seen for the last 7 decades. Meaning, it would benefit Wall Street primarily. It would benefit big oil and big, resource mining companies. It would benefit the military-industrial complex, and then maybe another few interest groups, but it would not benefit the United States. It would not benefit the American people. It would not create jobs in the United States. Gas wouldn't become free on gas stations for the American people. Everything would remain the same. You would just reward greatly the traditional instigators of war. So this is, why I see what's going on in Venezuela, and it's convincing. But I already mentioned that Trump has been during the campaign period, in 2023, 2024, he has been categorical that he intends to attack and disenfranchise the global financial elites. That's a very random thing to say. That's not the usual campaigning, because you could campaign pro and for abortion, prayer in schools, migrations, anti-democratic the anti-DNC. People were sick and tired of Biden and the Clintons and the DNC and Obama. Nobody was asking you about the banking elites. Nobody was asking you about Wall Street and City of London. So if Trump mentions this, if he's calling for the end to their dominance, that tells me that he and people around him thought things through, that they understand this problem, and that they are intending to tackle it. So if he regime changes Venezuela, he would be using American taxpayer money, lives of US Marines and American pilots and servicemen. So that would take a huge political risk, because that could go wrong. They just got their butts kicked by the Taliban in Afghanistan a few years ago. No, so there's always a risk of it all going wrong. So to go through with this, at the detriment of the wider system of the whole country, to the benefit of Wall Street and the military-industrial complex, that doesn't make any sense to me. That tells me that either he lost his marbles, or he's controlled opposition, or he's faking the whole thing like he did with North Korea in 2017, when it was, like he did with Iran a couple of months ago. And then he's doing the same thing, making a big dog and pony show, while at the same time he's negotiating with the Maduro regime. And it seems that that's exactly what's going on. So I'd reserve my judgment on Venezuela for the moment, and then by extension, Cuba and all the other countries. But it seems to me inconsistent with his core strategy, or at least mission. If he doesn't have a strategy, it's clear that he does have a mission. And let's see what happens, because if Maduro stays in power like he stayed in power after 2019, when the first time this whole dog and pony show over Venezuela started under Trump, then we can tell that this was as fake as a war on Iran. And then, I'm optimistic that Trump means what he says, that he hasn't lost his marbles, and that he's not controlled opposition, that he's just doing things in this way because he probably has to.
Alex, who's Israel today to the United States? When you see Ben Salman goes to the United States, gives, the investment that they're doing in the United States is unbelievable, in my opinion. But everything about Israel is just giving, and giving. Nothing receiving from Israel. Is that the project? Is this British project, is it about to fail, in your opinion?
I believe so. I think there's no question about it. I think that I've said this for years now, that if I were a Zionist, I wouldn't trust Trump very much at all. And I think that this is now becoming quite apparent. They obviously cannot treat Israel in an adversarial way overtly, because of the donor class, because of the Jewish Zionists, because of the Christian evangelicals that are all very powerful and extremely passionate part of the American political spectrum. But when you look at what is going on, you realize that Israel is in a worse and worse position. Trump isn't taking orders from Netanyahu, it's the other way around. I think it's kind of significant that when Trump made peace with the Yemenis, it's another thing that kind of went under the radar and hasn't been talked about. But there was no, the agreement was, okay, don't strike at our vessels in the region anymore, please, thank you very much. But not a word about don't strike at Israel. So that would be a very, very significant omission for any American administration. And then, the symbolic gestures of J.D. Vance going to Israel and not going to the Wailing Wall, but going to the Church of Holy Sepulchre. Trump giving a speech in the Knesset where he actually embarrasses Netanyahu and Herzog and his what's her face, the donor, the lady. I can't.
Yeah, Adelson, Miriam
Miriam Adelson. It's all very strange, it's all very unusual and very different than the type of conciliatory politics that we've gotten used to. And unfortunately, because they're not spelling it out for us, you have to kind of use your imagination. But if the objective, like with Ukraine, is to completely change the security architecture in the region, then I think that Israel has to either disappear or it has to have a major, let's call it, democratic transition. And in that sense, I don't think that the two-state solution is realistic at all anymore. I think it will have to be a one-state solution. And who knows, maybe it won't be called Israel, maybe it'll be called Palestine. And maybe Jews and Christians and Muslims will live in peace for once.